Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us here today on the last day of June, which of course is Pride Month. And what a better way to celebrate Pride Month than to participate in what is going to be an amazing conversation. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner and my pronouns are she and hers. And as I like to do at the start of any presentation here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, I do want to start off by acknowledging that the land that I'm on, and I come to you today from the Salt Lake Valley, was traditionally Indigenous land. And we here at the University of Utah acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples in their traditional homeland, and we respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government. And we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So it seems really appropriate that we should be gathering here to have this important community outreach activity and discussion to talk about not just Pride Month, but this really wonderful book, Surpassing Certainty, What My Twenties Taught Me by Janet Mock. And so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to introduce our three amazing panelists who are each going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then that'll leave us with 15 minutes or so for questions at the end of the panel. But you don't have to wait until the end to ask your question. If you'd like to go ahead and put it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a box that says Q&A. Go ahead and put your questions in there. And we'll be sure to ask those questions of our panelists at the end of their presentations. So first, let's talk a little bit about the book. So the book is riveting, rousing, and utterly real. Surpassing Certainty is a portrait of a young woman searching for her purpose and place in the world without a roadmap to guide her. It is an honest appraisal of what it means to be true to yourself. The journey begins a few months before her 20th birthday, when Tenisha Mock is adjusting to the days as a first-generation college student at the University of Hawaii, and her nights as a dancer at a strip club. Finally content in her body, she vacillates between flaunting and concealing herself as she navigates dating and disclosure, sex and intimacy, and most importantly, letting herself be truly seen. Under the neon lights of Club New, Janet meets Troy, a yeoman stationed at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, who becomes her first. The pleasure and perils of their union serve as a backdrop for Janet's progression through her early 20s and all of the universal growing pains, falling in and out of love, living away from home, and figuring out what she wants to do with her life. Despite her disadvantages and fueled by her dreams and an inevitable drive, Tenisha makes her way through New York City while holding her truth close. She builds a career in a highly competitive world of magazine publishing within the unique context of being trans, a woman, and a person of color. So we're really excited to have our three panelists today who are going to be talking a little bit about poignant pieces from the book that really struck them, but also building on that and talking a little bit about their own experiences. So we're going to start today with Claire Lemke, who has a PhD and is director of the LGBT Resource Center here at the University of Utah. And after Dr. Lemke, then we're going to move to Engels, Tejeda, who is a partner at Holland and Hart here in Salt Lake City, and also one of our wonderful alumni, a graduate of the class of 2006. And last but certainly not least is Professor Beth Jennings, who is an assistant librarian and faculty member here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. So I'm really excited to have them. We had a chance to talk a little bit about what they're going to be talking about yesterday. It's wonderful. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lemke. Dr. Lemke?
Thank you, Dean, for having me here in this conversation. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad everyone turned out bright and early, right at 8 a.m. to have this conversation. So looking forward to it. As the dean mentioned, my name is Dr. Claire Lemke, pronouns used as she, her, hers. And to tell you a little bit about my takeaways from Surpassing Certainty, I really like this book. I enjoy it. I also enjoy Janet Mock's first memoir. I'm a memoir person. But one reason why, in particular, I like this book and thought it was great to have the conversation that we're having here today is because I think there's so much to mine from this story from a higher education perspective, from those of us who work in higher ed as professors or student affairs professionals. I just think that there's a lot here that will be familiar to those of us who work in higher education, particularly with students directly. So to give you some context of what the educational journey is for Mock in this story, she begins as a first-generation college student who is Black and multiracial from a low-income household. She's a trans woman of color. She starts her college career at the University of Hawaii as a commuter student. She does a semester exchange program at a school in New England and then goes on to journalism school in New York City. And after graduation, begins working in the magazine publishing industry. So, I would say there's a few things I would encourage people to pay attention to while reading this book. First is that Mock shows a lot of qualities and strengths that I personally have seen in first generation students. So things like autonomy, resilience, drive, the persistence to figure out university systems on their own or, learn campus cultures with very little guidance without having someone giving them a roadmap beforehand. So, throughout this story is a student who keeps going above and beyond. So, she's working a job as a dancer in a strip club in the evenings to help support her family's household income while then going to school in the daytime. She is having to figure out, how is it that one is even a college student or a graduate student or an intern at a large magazine firm when she's never had someone in her life walk that path for her. And in fact, she's the first person in her family trailblazing in that way. And she's very aware of it. There's a point where she's graduating college and she says, I want my little cousins to see me doing this so they know that they can do it too. So really, you've seen so much how much determination it's taking her to walk this path, through her academic career into her professional career. And I think many of us who have worked with first generation students will see some familiar parts to that story. Something else I think that is really great about this book from an educational perspective is Mock's story spotlights a lot of the challenges and barriers that students from historically underserved communities face when they enter higher education. So something that struck me is Mock talks about her family gave her everything they had in terms of their support, their love and time, supporting her dreams, not standing in her way when it came to her coming into her own womanhood and medical transition and things like that they gave everything they could. But one thing that they couldn't give her was this reference for this life that she's entering into, through education, through a professional career. And she couldn't get the same type of support and guidance that she saw many of her peers getting around her. And there's a scene that was so poignant to me. She talks about starting her career as a graduate student, going from Hawaii to New York City, carrying just 2 bags to her name, that's it, that's all her belongings, and having to carry them up this 5-story walk up by herself. And when she gets into the apartment where she's going to be living with 2 roommates who she's never met, their families are there helping them unpack. And she talks about feeling so alone in that moment. And I just felt that was so striking, the discrepancy between some students who have so many resources, so much support. They've had people who, in their families who've been through this experience before that can kind of take their hand through it. And then other students really being asked to kind of do it on their own. She also talks about feeling imposter syndrome, I think, is kind of related to this, sense of aloneness, right? That she doesn't seem to fit as effortlessly as some of her classmates do, who, this environment was more built with them in mind. So she finds herself questioning if she should be there in graduate school. And so I think there's so much there, again, that with those of us who've worked with first gen or students from a low income family, that will seem familiar. Another section of the book that really struck me is she describes her semester exchange program in New England. So she goes from her institution, Hawaii, and Hawaii is a very racially diverse place, ethnically diverse place, to a predominantly white institution. And she describes experiencing tokenism for the first time. And she describes experiencing a type of racialized misogyny that she really hadn't experienced before. And so she also talks about being sexually assaulted on campus, and as a result of that assault, ending her exchange program a semester early. And then also thinking about her time in graduate school. She talks about being one of 5 Black women in her graduate program, and having predominantly white faculty, many of whom she talks about what she took away from those experiences or experiences of mentorship. But again, always kind of having to navigate and fit herself in rather than the program or the space being made with her in mind. So again, those types of experiences they resonated so much with me of, thinking about students of color that I've worked with, particularly women of color, and, them talking about their experiences in predominantly white institutions. Lastly, something that strikes me so much about this book, again, from the perspective of a student affairs practitioner, is that this is a story of a young trans woman who's coming into her own. But throughout this time, she has to remain guarded for her own safety in different school and work environments. So really, she experiences very little intimacy in her relationships with other students, with university staff, with professors. Some of that is around her, feeling that she doesn't need to disclose her trans identity to everyone, which certainly she doesn't, but also feeling as if there's just certain pieces of herself and her story that she's not comfortable or not safe disclosing in certain environments. So she talks about always keeping her guard up. And throughout the book, we see her test this and kind of gain more confidence in herself and practice putting trust in people in a different way. And that's really a large part of her journey, which I appreciate so much. But I think also looking at her experiences and comparing it to trans and non-binary students that I see on our campus or other campuses, I do think there is something very familiar of this always having to be on guard, always having to test, always having to question if this relationship will change, if someone knows this piece about your identity. And I think that kind of being on guard in higher education spaces is very common for trans students, and it takes a toll, right? It means not being able to relax and not being able to have a certain type of intimacy with peers or mentors. So I'm going to leave you with this to think about, and maybe, we can talk about it later. You can think about it on your own as you read the book. What I would leave you to think about or ask after reading this book is what types of institutional support would have made a difference in Mock's story. And so in a lot of ways, Mock's is exceptional. She's exceptional, right? She's a success story. She's highly accomplished. She's a celebrity, right? She's written and been involved in so many wonderful, exciting projects, and is really, shaping our current, historical narrative and, cultural context, right? Like, she is an exceptional person and very talented. However, much of her story shows her succeeding and achieving despite her environment in higher education, rather than being, really fueled and sustained and supported by it. It's always this navigation of she kind of has to take what she needs and leave what doesn't work for her. So I would have us think about, again, from the perspective of people who work in higher education, how can we do better by students like Mock? And, thinking about the ways, again, she's an exceptional person, but there's so much here of her story that is familiar. And there are so many students at our campus navigating similar contexts and, sharing similar identities as what's represented in this book. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I'm going to pass it along to Engels.
Thank you so much. There is always danger when following someone who is an academic in all these things, because they usually cover pretty much everything that you've thought about, but they do so much more eloquently. So, for a trial lawyer, that's a huge hit to my ego. So I'll start there. But I do want to just say that I think you hit it right on the spot. For me, this book was had a lot that was very, very familiar. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I would say overall, the book was extremely educational for me. I would say intensely educational. I think, I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, and frankly, and embarrassingly, the transgender people and their journeys are probably the journey that I'm least familiar with. And I thought that this book was incredibly effective at educating me on at least this person's story in a very intimate way, in a very honest way. And and it's great writing. Also, she's got, again, as a trial attorney, I really enjoy great prose, and she's excellent at it, I think. I frankly don't read a lot of memoirs. They tend to be, particularly from the politicians, they tend to be a bit self-aggrandizing and that sort of thing, just kind of promoting. But this was so honest and layered and deep. And so that's some of the things that I picked up. Again, Dr. Lemke already touched on this, but intersectionality. She talked a lot about the struggles and joys and experiences that she had, both from the perspective as a woman who happens to be a transgender woman, but also as a racial and ethnic minority. And I thought that there were so many interesting things there. The first time that this came up for me in the book is when she starts talking about her relationship with her family. And I thought that it was so interesting how her family reacted to her being a transgender woman and living as a woman and presenting as a woman. I thought it was really telling also how she describes the reaction of her culture to this, particularly of the Native Hawaiian culture, and they have a term for it that she describes early on. I think it's mahu, and she kind of just talks about how this is a role that the society had come to accept in a way that seemed foreign to me, frankly, from the mainland perspective, and very telling about how they reacted to this. I question how the society reacted to someone who was gay or lesbian as opposed to transgender. And I think that's one of those areas that I like to explore a little bit more following this. And again, a sign of a great book when it inspires you to look for more. But I thought that was really telling and instructive. I thought that to the point, another theme that I picked up here was in terms of familiarity. I think the story is strangely familiar in terms of what the stories that women tell about their own experiences during this time of their lives, right? So everything from dealing with body image issues and never feeling like you're good enough, or trying to hide some parts, to exposing those insecurities, dealing with sex and dating and privacy, autonomy, control, feeling like you belong to someone and you're no one until you do. In explaining that in a level of detail that I think I hadn't seen before. The issue about that incident that Dr. Lemke touched on, when she is essentially raped in a college dorm, was incredibly revealing to me, in part because of the detail that she provides, and kind of one of the things that people who haven't experienced this kind of trauma always ask, whether for lack of out of ignorance or just because we just haven't been there. But one of the things that we always ask is, how does this happen? How do you get yourself into a position like this? Or how does this perpetrator come to the place that he or she has? And I thought that it was really telling how she explained it. And so one of the things that I would encourage people to pay close attention to, particularly those in either the educational system, but really any one of us, frankly, anyone in law should pay close attention to how she got to this moment, and how the perpetrator came to, and how it unfolded, and how quickly it unfolded. I mean, there was a moment essentially she goes to visit this person, this man whom she has been, making out in a library, a classmate. And she's bored. She says, hey, I want to come to your room or whatever. He invites her actually to her room, to his room. They're sitting there, and he starts making advances on her. She pushes away, and he takes her shirt and throws her on his bed. And while she goes to retrieve it, then he proceeds to assault her. I thought, just playing that out was so telling, given all the stories that we've heard over the last few years about this subject. Again, it's something that is extremely familiar to many people. I thought that the perspective of the race and gender intersection were also very telling, and stuff that's very familiar to me, having moved to Utah at the age of 13 and being in an environment that was completely foreign to me. The references, there were some trivial stuff like references to Alec McBeal inspiring her to go to law school. Guilty, probably fall right there with her, unfortunately. But also something extremely telling about this, which is, in her case, she luckily found people to dissuade her from doing that just based on a TV show. Not so much in my case, although it turned out to work just as well. But I would say that what was really interesting for me, I think, again, Dr. Lemke touched on this, is that for people who are first generation students, call it first generation students in higher education, this is where we get much of our information. Much of our information comes from media about what college is about. There is a telling moment where she's meeting with two classmates back in Hawaii on campus, and she's trying to decide to do a double major, and because that's all she knows. It's like, she knows that she likes education. She knows that her degree in, I think it was fashion at the time, fashion management or merchandising, wasn't enough. So she says, well, okay, maybe I'll couple it with another major in journalism. And I thought, I've been there. I've had those very same thoughts. I'm thinking, first time anyone in my family is getting a BA, and that's a big deal. And so you have this other student who says, I would not do that, and says, I would apply to graduate school. And it's a whole different thing. And she describes how she's heard about grad school before, but it just never really was anything that you contemplated doing. The difference between grad school and a BA degree in her field and in many fields is huge in terms of your career opportunities and so on. And she talks about how her classmate knew what the proper path was. Her classmate knew that the next step was graduate school and how to get to them, which ones to apply, and so on. And there's this huge distinction between her and her classmate. Tellingly, in that same narrative, she talks about the role that her academic advisors had in helping her choose the right place and how to get there, how to pour more of yourself into those application forms and so on. Again, experiences that are fairly familiar to me. A couple other tidbits that I think you should pay attention to when you're looking at this. She's a very smart writer, and every once in a while she gives us this little nuggets of wisdom. Like at one point she says, hair is political, which I thought was very, very poignant and something, again, that I hear particularly Black women mention often. And I thought that it was brilliant. I really found fascinating the degree of control she exerted, probably, frankly, out of some fear at times, but the degree of control she had over disclosure and telling when she would choose to tell people about being transgender, when she thought that it didn't matter at all, and when she thought she wouldn't share it. And I also think she would acknowledge that that's a privilege she has that many other people in her position don't necessarily have. But I thought that was really telling. And again, coming from a perspective of a person who's gone through the whole coming out process, it's something that was instructional for me and seemed familiar as well. But along with that, just having, Dr. Lemke talked about the imposter syndrome. there is something else that happens to many of us who are member of the LGBTQ community and who would empathize with this, which is this issue about being found out. And it's just a whole different level of imposter syndrome, if you will, where you feel like, even when people know that you are LGBTQ, that they are not quite accepting of you, and you just feel like you're constantly out of place. And I think she does a really good job about explaining how that plays out. So overall, I think it's a very, very instructional book. It's very well written. And I would say that along the lines of what Dr. Lemke said, the challenge that I think that I would pick up from this is thinking through about people with that journey, right? And how can we make our spaces, whether it's our workspaces, our laws, and I know that Beth Jennings is going to talk about this in a minute, but how can our society as a whole make sure that our fellow citizens and our fellow human beings who are going through these experiences can achieve their potential and can feel comfortable in their skin and in their spaces and can contribute to everything else that we do. So that's what I came out of it, and I am really grateful that I was invited to this panel so that I could take some time to do some reading and learn something new. Thanks a lot. Let me pass it over to Beth.
Like everyone else said, this book was really a really interesting insight, I think, into a really remarkable person's life and coming of age story. One thing when I was preparing for this, I found that the title of the book, Surpassing Certainty, is actually based on an Audre Lorde quote, which is, the quote is, "And at last you'll know with surpassing certainty that only one thing is more frightening than speaking your truth, and that is not speaking." And I think you can see that very clearly in the book that, as she moves through her young adulthood into, kind of her professional life, just deciding when and how to speak that truth becomes more and, kind of moves to the forefront of how Mock decides to move through the world, whether or not she's choosing to disclose. And, as Professor Lemke said, that, staying on guard and choosing whether or not to disclose is something that a lot of queer people struggle with. And one of those things that, might force a particular person to disclose more than they had wanted to are the documents that we use to move through the world every day. So if you're thinking about a driver's license, a birth certificate, a passport, moving through any kind of major life event, for example, trying to get healthcare, trying to access housing, employment, you get a new job, you need to bring your copy of your birth certificate and your driver's license or your passport with your W-9 to even sign up to, be paid. And there's a lot of parts of our lives that require these identifying documents. And, while reading this book, we don't see a lot of those struggles that Mock is having because many of those things were resolved before she began adulthood. And so she was able to change, I presume, some identifying documents in her life so that when she did things like, find housing for herself, register for school, become employed at various different companies, providing those documents didn't force her to disclose her gender identity. And so, I guess the history of her gender identity, maybe would be a better way to say that. And so, a lot of studies have also shown that having identifying documents that match your gender identity can also, in addition to, helping you access the just the bare minimums of what people need to survive in the world, it also has a really huge impact on mental health for trans people as well. And so places where having access to changing your gender marker is easy and kind of pro forma, folks that are able to get those identifying documents matching their gender identity, are at lower risk for just some really negative psychological outcomes. And so, those identifying documents can really help mental health wise as well. But the tricky part is that depending on which state you were born in and depending on which state you live in, access to the process of changing a gender marker and a name can be quite easy, or it can be quite difficult or almost impossible. Because there's no federal standard for this. Clearly this is something that would be covered by state laws. And in some states, changing your gender marker is you filling out a form where you just, a self-attestation where you're saying, this is my gender, and you just turn it into the office. And in other states, the process is a lot more rigorous, and you might have to appear in front of a judge. And then the judge would determine whether or not you've met the legal standard for changing your gender marker on your identifying documents. And in some states, you even still have to, for a name change, even, you would still have to publish in a newspaper or a public record, about your name change, which could even further put at risk disclosing your things to people that is not really their business, frankly. And some states still require surgery. And, knowing what we know about trans people, particularly trans people of color's access to healthcare, requiring surgery or, psychiatric care or letters from doctors, like that's just one more barrier that is being put in people's way, in way of, accessing just basic safety and the necessities of life. So here in Utah, historically, there's a law, the state legislature made a law back in the 1970s that said that a judge could order Vital Records Office to change a gender marker on somebody's birth certificate. However, since then, the legislature has declined to create a framework so for people to go in front of a judge to ask for a gender marker change. For example, something like a name change or many other civil and probate issues, the courts have developed a standard and you need to just prove ABC, and when you prove ABC, the judge will approve it, and then you get it. So the legislature has not provided that framework for trans people in Utah. And so what that meant up until recently was that depending on where you live, it might be very easy to get a gender marker change, or it might be impossible. I feel like Utah is similar to many other states in the West, where we have some larger urban areas where the judges in those areas are really familiar with, trans experiences and why this is necessary. And an individual going in front of one of those judges might have a really positive experience, and there would be very little questions. Where in the more rural counties, working with clients through the Rainbow Law Clinic at the University of Utah, judges have asked for proof of surgery, even though that's not a standard in our laws. Judges have asked for a variety of really invasive questions, and then ultimately the person's petition might not be granted. And so last month, the Utah Supreme Court issued an opinion that has actually established a framework for trans people in Utah to be able to get their gender marker changed. And so I had the opportunity to work of counsel along with the attorneys who were representing clients in Ogden who went before a judge asking for a gender marker change, and the judge just declined to issue the gender marker change. The judge issued the name changes, but he wouldn't issue the gender marker changes. And it's been before the Utah Supreme Court for a number of years, and just waiting for the Supreme Court to issue a standard. And so they did. So now there's a way for people to be assured, no matter where they live in Utah, that their petition for a gender marker change is going to be granted, which is a huge relief to many people. Like I said, particularly in more rural areas where you might not be able to find an attorney to represent you in a gender marker change petition. And now most people in those areas are pro se, meaning they're representing themselves, and having a really clear standard is just a huge relief for folks to be able to know that, when they go in front of a judge, no matter where they live in Utah, that they are going to be able to get that gender marker change issued. And so, that I think to me was the part that really struck me about Janet Mock's, this second memoir of hers, was that, a lot of the places where she was choosing to disclose it was a decision that she could make. And because she had resolved so many of the more nitty gritty details before, she entered into adulthood. And so I personally am hugely relieved and very happy that the Utah Supreme Court made the decision that they did, because I think what that will mean is that trans individuals in Utah, as they enter into adulthood, like Mock did, they will be able to make a decision whether or not they're going to disclose, and they can be assured that they're safe and that they have access to housing and education and healthcare and the things that they need to have a safe and healthy life. So I guess now I'll turn the time back over to Dean Kronk Warner.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those excellent presentations. So now we have a little bit, we have time for questions and answers. So again, by way of reminder, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A box. And so please go ahead and type your questions into the box. And while we wait for our attendees to ask some questions, I had two questions of the panelists. So the first question is, could you expound and share for those who want to be allies to the trans community, what are some common misconceptions and mistakes that allies or would-be allies sometimes make? So speaking for myself, I know I made a terrible mistake in my past when I shared somebody's trans identity with somebody that I felt was safe, and the person was safe, but I realized after the fact that that was a big mistake. Maybe you could share a little bit about why my mistake was so horrible, and I did apologize to that individual. And then the second question, I wonder if you'd be willing to expound a hot topic in the news right now. Is this controversy around trans individuals competing in sports. And I know that that's going to come up in the Olympics because we have our first trans woman, I believe, who's competing in the Olympics. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts on that debate. So first question is, what are common misconceptions, mistakes that would-be allies make? And do you have any thoughts on this controversy around trans individuals competing in sports?
I mean, I can say for sure that I have mistakenly misgendered people before. Choosing to make a bigger deal about it, like an apology and then moving on, is a great way to do it. I think sometimes people, like when we make mistakes, I think there's some kind of instinct sometimes to really really make a big deal about it. And then you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, and then it turns into like a really big thing. And I know that, sometimes that makes the mistake or the accident or whatever turn into a much larger thing than it really needs to be, which is just, I'm sorry, my mistake, I won't do it again, So I think that is one thing to think about. As far as the trans athletes in sports, I feel like that's a whole separate webinar. But thinking in Utah's history, in the late 90s, at a high school here in Salt Lake, there was a group of it was to form a gay straight alliance here in Salt Lake City, at a high school here in Salt Lake, and the school didn't want to allow it. The school district didn't want to allow it. So instead, the school district, or this particular school, said, we're not going to have any clubs anymore. If we have to host a gay straight alliance, we're not going to have any clubs. No chess club, no pep club, no, nothing. We're not going to have any clubs anymore. If they're going to require us to have this gay straight alliance at the school. Now, and this was at East High School. Now, obviously that was not well received. And, ultimately the gay straight alliance went through, and, that I don't know if it's still a club there, but, I feel like they have all kinds of clubs now. And I feel like it's just a really good example of why, state to state, how state legislatures or, school boards and those types of groups can have a really huge impact on kids' lives. If you have right now, these state legislatures taking up, trans athletes. I mean, our legislature here in Utah already brought forward legislation about trans athletes in Utah, and the governor vetoed it. And, they're talking about trying to bring it back again. And it just, thinking a lot about, an imagined impact it might have on cis students competing against trans students. This is like a scenario that hasn't happened yet, or we haven't heard about yet. This imagined bad story versus like the actual impact of what it would feel like as a trans child reading and hearing every day the lawmakers in your state think so poorly of you that they would, essentially say like, no, you can't be on the bowling team, or, it's just, I think it's really, I think it's heartbreaking, honestly. And it just, unrelenting time to live as a trans child. Just every day you're hoping that, they have the support and the resiliency that, that Janet had in her book. But, kids shouldn't have to have that. We should be out here protecting and lifting kids up. So, I mean, it's not, like I said, that's a whole nother webinar, but.
I'm happy to speak to Dean Kronk Warner, the scenario you gave, and you said if you could explain kind of what's problematic about disclosing for someone, and I think that's not just around gender identity, but I think there's so much in the work that I do in the LGBT Resource Center. We have a heightened awareness of privacy, just knowing that people are navigating very complex privacy situations, and you can't always know what that is. So for instance, there might be a student who is very out, open, an activist even on campus, but their home community, the family does not know about their LGBTQ plus identity, right? And so while they might be very comfortable being out on campus, they would not want, say, communication to go back to their home community that would signal something about their queer or trans identity, right? Or someone might, work or be in a major that does not feel affirming, is not affirming, right? So there might be certain spaces on campus where they might use a different name, go by a different set of pronouns, right? And so in my job, what I often do is just double check with people on, where, so for instance, I might have a student that they go by a chosen name and pronouns they've told me, in conversation center, like that's how I know them. But if I'm writing them a letter of recommendation, I will ask, what name and pronouns should I use in this letter? Because it's a different audience, right, than in our space or, with me in my office. So just always kind of checking. But I think that really comes down to, just a strong belief of you should let people tell their own stories, whether that's about, who they are in terms of their gender, their sexuality, their medical history, right? Like let people be in charge of who knows what information about them. I think it's just a general great rule to go by. But becomes, even more important when you're talking about people from a marginalized or minoritized community, right? So I think that's to speak to that. I think, thinking about allyship, a couple of things come to mind. I think one, and I think this book is such a great example of that, is avoid distilling someone. If you're, someone's trans, they've disclosed that to you, avoid making that the end all and be all of their identity, their experience, right? Because I think even in the case of people like Janet Mock, who, trans identity is very important, is politically salient for her. There's so much more, such a much more multifaceted experience that exists in concert with her transness, right? So not, seeing someone just through that lens, I think is important. And I think also self-education is important, right? Not putting the burden on people with a minoritized identity to always be in a teaching position. There's, wonderful resources and so many opportunities to learn that doesn't, involve the emotional labor of other people. I think that that's a great place as an ally to be at. To speak to your conversation on sports, I know, yes, it's definitely in the news right now, and we certainly just, lived through that bill that was targeting trans girls in particular in Utah schools. I will say, so our center just recently had a discussion on our Facebook Live. If you want to go back and watch the video, we watched a documentary called Changing the Game, and we had a conversation with Nona Richardson from the U's athletic department on this topic. So Nona is a great source of information. So if you want to take a look at the LGBT Resource Center's Facebook page, you can see our conversation there. I'd also recommend the documentary Changing the Game. I thought it was fantastic. And something that was a large takeaway for me from that documentary, it follows 3 trans athletes in high school, so high school students, was one of their coaches was saying, people get caught up in this idea of wins and losses and fairness in sport and all that, but wins and losses are motivational. What sport is, especially at a high school level, is about, instilling values, giving people resources, right? Teamwork, gaining confidence, leadership skills. Why would we keep resources from children? Because of their gender identity, right? So I think that was a very powerful, poignant thing to think about for me. So yeah, I don't know, Engels, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So on the first question on allyship, I would say that the mistakes are something that I'm very familiar with. I talk a lot, and it comes as a byproduct. It's a risk that you take when you have the personality that like mine, and when you choose to let your personality run free. So you end up making a lot of mistakes. I would say one thing that I learned, that I picked up from the book, again, people, she verbalizes things much better than thoughts that I've had, but expresses them in a much better way. There's a scene where she describes a person who suffers from dwarfism, or who was born with dwarfism. And she describes how that person inspired her about her own personal issues and personality traits. And one of the things she says is that she describes a point where she says she admires how this friend of hers handled being constantly looked at and stared and questioned and that sort of thing. And she says that the person's response when things got too intense is that she would look at people and say, the politically correct term is pause, and they should say Asian American, not address the dwarfism at all. And so everybody, which I thought went to Claire's point. And the reason I bring that up is that I do think that people who want to be allies make a lot of mistakes in getting there. And I think that, I don't, as a minority in Utah, I don't want to cut too much slack to people. I want people to get educated. But I also think that most of us, and allies should understand, that most of us have dealt with all of the discomfort our whole lives. And so we have mechanisms to deal with them, right? And many of the conversations that I have with people who are first generation, anything, from any background, walking into a room where you are not familiar with, is to make sure that you give some room for people to grow in this, in these fields, to learn the correct language, be a bit forgiving, so that they can catch up, right? And I thought that story was so telling about the woman who says, just addresses something else, and it gives people something else to think about. Oh yeah, you are also this, you're not just transgender or whatever it is. So I would say, we all make mistakes, but I do think that picking up a book like this and reading through and understanding that story is a great first step, or it's a great step towards inclusivity. One on the debate thing, I thought this was also incredibly educational for me on the sports debate. I'm not a sports person. I should admit this. I was born in the Dominican Republic, where baseball is religion, and I expressed such little interest in it that they kicked me off the island and sent me over to the U.S. So it's just not my thing. But I understand the role that it plays in people's lives, and I understand the debate, frankly. And I thought that reading this book for me was very instructional in this way. This is a woman all throughout her entire life. There is no, the gender she was born with, what she presented us at birth had very little to do with whom she was internally, other than, it just didn't match, right? But this is a woman, and it comes through very early on without having to do, she didn't have to go and do a test to evaluate, whether she had more hormones of this type and the other, or anything crazy like that. It just, in the text, it just comes clearly and palpably that this is a woman. And I think that when people read things like memoirs like this, and they hear stories, first-person stories from people who have gone through this experience, it becomes very clear and very quickly that these people are the gender that they finally feel the freedom to present us. And I think that that's the power of individual stories and of having conversations like this. Earlier on, I think Beth Jennings said, when we were preparing for this, and it was actually, we had a malfunction in Beth, I'm going to steal this from you because it was so awesome. And, we were trying to decide about how to handle this thing. And she says, when we are not speaking, we're not visible. And I thought that it was really, I was taking my notes as to what I was going to say during this panel. And I thought, oh, wait, I'll take that. That's really great. Because it really is, on this issue, on trans, this trans debate, I think once people start hearing what this is really about, it becomes really hard to deny the reality that these are just, boys and girls competing in sports like every other person. And I don't think that physicality, I don't think that, you can move away from the conclusion that physicality has little to do with it. So, at least not to the extent that it wouldn't be between any other any other person. So anyway, so let me just say, that I am attending remotely from Dominican Republic, and I fear this will happen. This is my grandma in the back. And I've used her room too. There you go. I've used her room. So Zoom meetings have not reached Dominican Republic during the last year, apparently, and so my family's just not prepared for this. So there you go. We're attending live, and that's my grandma. All right, let me kick it off to someone else so that I can address this in the background.
Hola. Hola. That's wonderful. Love it. That's one of the great things about Zoom is we get to participate in people's lives a little bit more fully. So just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, to use the Q&A button at the bottom. I do have another question building on Dr. Lemke's point, where she kind of, you said you encouraged us to think about what as institutions we can or should be doing. And so I wonder if you have any thought on that, thinking both through, obviously the S.J. Quinney College of Law is a higher education institution, and so that's certainly relevant here. And then also we have many attendees who are at law firms or who are working for nonprofits, so kind of employer institutions. Do you have any thoughts on what institutions can do to be more supportive and welcoming to members of the LGBTQIA community?
I do. And, I'm sure, anyone who wants to take a deeper dive in this, right, there's trainings and consultants that can also be of assistance. But I think, when I pose that question, I'm often thinking about like two different avenues. One is systemic, institutional, looking at the very systems that we interact with as employees or as students, who those are built for and who those create barriers for. So, even, thinking about everything from you have a job candidate coming in and is there a place to share a chosen name? Is there a place to disclose pronouns that the committee should use? Will the committee see any inappropriate information, such as a legal name they don't need to see, right, in order for that candidate to continue? Do you, like an institution like us, when your people are getting into our system, are there only 2 gender markers, right? And is, what is the policy around updating that or updating names? Those sorts of things. And, what does your benefits package look like for trans people, for same gender couples, right? Like, where are there gaps in coverage that their cisgender or heterosexual peers do not experience, right? Like, those would be like the systemic institutional questions that come to mind. And then I think the other avenue is thinking about the culture of your organization, your spaces, right, which is much more nuanced, right? Like thinking about what type of education has to happen, what type of team building has to happen, what kind of equity in hiring needs to happen to make sure that you have a diverse mix of individuals that are contributing to that workplace that can, help build an inclusive, welcoming culture for a lot of different types of people, and who can, bring their full selves, feel comfortable doing that into the workplace. So that's kind of an off the cuff. I don't know if Beth or Engels, if you have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I would just add, for law firms in particular, for practicing attorneys, we have an awesome opportunity to participate in this debate and this conversation about gender equity, because both of what we do, where in the themes that we're familiar with and that we handle on a day-to-day basis for clients, and for everyone, really, for society. So I think we have a huge role that we can play there. I would also remind folks from any background or from in any industry that most people after formal education, their place of training and where they learn to deal with new things is at work. This is your place of employment, is usually your educational platform after your formal education ends. And so there's a huge opportunity to have conversations at work and training about how to deal with this issue. And so I would encourage people to host guest speakers and to have conversations and training about things like proper name and gender and pronoun and all of those things. I think it's something that many people used to feel like, oh, does that really have anything to do with selling widgets, or how does that, what's the correlation between, and they want to keep the politics out of work. And I think what we've learned during the last decade or so, and I'm grateful for this, is that people bring all this stuff to work, right? And so you got to address it here. So I do encourage people to do corporate training events about gender and identification. I think that they tend to work well, at least in my experience. They're always somewhat awkward, like everything else that you do that isn't related to selling widgets, if that's what you do. But I'm always pleased with the outcome of these things, because they always lead to these sort of uncomfortable yet necessary conversations, like water cooler conversations, where people will come up to you and say, some of the things that Dean Warner was talking about earlier, where, people just say odd things that it's in their minds. I had someone during the civil rights debate of last year, in the continuing debate about racial equality and policing. And someone walked into my office and says, well, you're the only Black person I know, so I want to talk to you about it. And they just went off for like 20 minutes of all these things that I thought, wow, it's 2020, and even though it's a weird year, even now, that's kind of, but I was so happy to hear and engage in that conversation, because here was someone who genuinely wanted to know how to address some of these things. So that's what I would say about what we can do. And then, again, as lawyers, we do have a unique role that we can play, a meaningful role that we can play on individuals, whether it's helping people with name change issues or addressing legal issues in their place of employment.
I think that Engels brought up something really important that I think is applicable across a lot of different aspects of our lives, but and Dr. Lemke did as well, is that there are people whose job it is, who get paid to train us how to be better allies to different communities that we're not a member of, and those would be the people who would be the preferred people to help you learn more. Not particularly, I'm certain that the person that asked you the questions, Engels, was a great person, but putting people on the spot and requiring them to represent an entire community that you have maybe even just inferred that they're a member of, is not the best route. And so, even, it's cool because now, we have these, like, it's like a computer and you can just type in some things into Google and, even just a light Google, not a deep dive, just a light Google could probably answer a lot of the questions that you're curious about. And being able to maintain a relationship with the person that you're interested in learning more about their community, as opposed to kind of, forcing them into a situation where they're teaching you and they may not have the capacity or the desire or, not even want to. So that would just be my only thing.
Yeah, when Engels was telling his story, I was thinking the response you would get from me if somebody did that, since I'm Indian, would really depend on the day. But kudos to you for being patient and taking the time.
Well, I mean, it just brought up, like, so when my wife and I were expecting a baby, not a lot, but there were a couple people who'd be like, well, how? I'm like, I don't think you really want I don't even know you. We're on the bus, and so just, again, just a light Google, just a quick little, I'm sure you can figure it out. So.
Well, on the light Google comment, which I know comes from a librarian, so there you go, some good advice. Really enjoyed and appreciated this panel. I thought, I know I certainly learned a lot, really enjoyed reflecting on this book. I thought the book was really interesting and lots of good things. We could probably continue on discussing it. And also really appreciate the advice from our panelists in terms of what those of us who are would-be allies can do, what potentially our institutions can do to better support the community, and then also just reflecting on some hot topics right now. It was briefly mentioned, but I do just want to do a shout out to our Rainbow Law legal site clinic, because we can help with short-term legal advice. So we do offer that service. And so if you want to reach out to our pro bono initiative, which oversees the Rainbow Law Center, they would be happy to help, or if they can't help, put you in connection with the right.
Or you can volunteer. You can volunteer if you're a licensed attorney. I'm happy to train anyone on how to help someone who needs to get a gender marker change.
There you go. Even better. A great way to be an ally. Well, wonderful. I want to thank again our panelists. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. We're going to take a break in July from the Dean's Book Review because there are so many holidays and people need to go on vacation. So we'll be back in August, but everybody enjoy the 4th of July, enjoy Pioneer Day, and we'll see you in August. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.